Welcome to today's episode of the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry. I am by myself in the studio today. So today's episode is part of our mini-series entitled Becoming an Activist Lawyer. Now you might remember our first episode, this is our second. Our first episode in this series was a discussion with Jack McClelland, our former co-host, before he jetted off again, where we spoke generally about the various ways someone might explore the option of becoming a human rights lawyer or solicitor or barrister, working on climate justice, criminal justice, and so on. Now, we didn't explore the particular areas, but drew on some of the advice kindly put forward by our podcast guests when we asked them the question about how somebody might become involved in their line of work. And that question really arises from our listeners and people who are interested in getting more information on how they might get into human rights work as a lawyer. So I hope you enjoyed the exploration of some of our responses to that. Now, today I'm looking at the question we ask many of our guests, and that is on activism and the law, the relationship between the two, how they work together, and indeed if they work together in terms of making meaningful change. So for some of our guests, this is a pretty obvious question. The answer is yes. And that's because their activism is the reason that they became a lawyer, and they're happy to share that. For others, it's a little bit more complex. Some might not like the term activist lawyer or activism being attributed to their work, and they're also happy to share that. And some of our guests, most of them, were already passionate about human rights in general, or even a particular area that they wanted to work in, and felt that they could help contribute to the pursuit of justice, either by working within the law and using it strategically, or by helping individuals on a case-by-case basis achieve results. And of course, we've interviewed people from NGOs and organisations with a legal background who are happy to share their journeys and their activism in the context of working within the legal framework. So today we might look at how the law, I suppose it has a complex and often interdependent relationship between activism and the law through the lens of our guests and my own observations, and I'll do a little summary at the end. But both activism and the law, as we know, are vital forces for change, for social change, albeit they operate through very different mechanisms. Activism is typically driven by grassroots movements, advocacy groups, and individuals working to challenge the status quo, raise awareness, and demand reform on issues like civil rights, environmental justice, or economic inequality. The law, on the other hand, functions through established systems of governance, rules, and judicial processes. While activists often seek to push boundaries or expose injustice, the law tends to reflect the existing power structures or societal norms, sometimes lagging behind social progress. Now, one of the guests that I'll mention is Una Boyd, and Una is an immigration solicitor working with the Committee on the Administration of Justice in Northern Ireland, the CAJ. And she was asked the question on activism and the law, and her response really resonated with me. And I mean, doing subjects and specialising early on in areas like immigration or particular human rights areas isn't always a popular choice, or so it might be perceived. Una mentioned her mum describing it as hippie law, and I really related to that because I've heard that many times, or similar descriptions. But indeed, thankfully, it didn't put Una off her journey and her fantastic work, and it didn't really put me off either. But Una notes that she wasn't, like some of our guests, interested in doing law in particular, but she saw that it could be a route to impacting change and helping people. She said, I think too often there's a bit of a disconnect between legal practitioners and lawyers and the campaigns and kind of activism and community work on the ground. She goes on to say that very often when you have people who aren't from a legal background, they can be quite disenfranchised, or they might have quite a negative experience of the law. So they don't feel comfortable using or accessing the law as a tool. But you can affect so much change when you bring all of that together. So Una referred to a well-known, it'll be well-known, I think, across the island of Ireland and also in the UK and further afield. It's a citizens' rights case known as D'Souza, where she acted as solicitor and comments on the success in her episode. She comments on the success of the case at court, but also on the reason behind that success, which was ultimately the campaign started by her clients, Emma and Jake D'Souza. supported by others to have their rights recognised. Now, this was a significant campaign. I remember it very well. It was supported up and down the country by politicians, journalists, artists and citizens who collectively gave effect to that change, which impacted so many. So the court case was crucial, but was just one part of the process. And Una finished by saying that she would love to see the law recognised as that kind of positive and powerful tool. Now, moving on to our next guest, who was Frank McGuinness, barrister with Garden Court Chambers, and Frank recorded with us earlier this year. It was one of my favourite episodes. Frank, on this question, he felt it was a very important question and a vital question to address, as did he feel the platform that we were offering lawyers to discuss their work was very important too. But he said, although the question on activism and the law is vital, it's not an easy question to answer. And Frank emphasised throughout the importance of reading and mentioned a book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which talks about how really to be emancipatory and to avoid domination and oppression, education has to be a dialogue of equals. Frank talks about the tensions. I found this really interesting as well because it was in the context of lawyers and clients. And he spoke about the tensions that exist between some of his clients and what they want to do and what the laws of the state are telling them to do. He talks of entering into dialogue with clients, but he recognises that this isn't always easy, particularly where strategies come into conflict with laws that are already passed by the state. His view is to find ways to act collectively to make effective change. And his reading, he cites other authors too that really support his activism and the way he works through the legal profession. Now, it's a really fascinating episode. And if you haven't heard it, I would urge you to check it out and have a listen. It's really, really fascinating to hear how Frank approaches some of the questions that we asked him. Now, another really great guest that we had on was Daniel Macover, who is partner and solicitor with Hickman and Rose, based in London. And Daniel has worked in so many high-profile human rights cases for many, many years. And we asked him this question on activism and the law and how it works together. He went straight to commending his clients when we asked him about using the legal framework to advance causes and to make real change. And the courage of the client can never be underestimated in his view. He says, just being able to have the courage and the burning sense of the need to get justice, that is with the client. So you have to say the clients are key to all of this. He mentions Marcia Rigg, one of his clients, who's become an amazing campaigner. They change things and we are their instruments of change. He feels privileged to act for such courageous people. And he reflects on this throughout the episode, but also indeed in terms of his career. Now, he does go on to refer to current cases like Grenfell, where campaigners and lawyers are pushing for criminal justice for the victims, or indeed cases that he's working on involving prisoner reform, another huge area involving teams of lawyers and campaigners. He mentions violence in prisons and uncovering the systemic nature of that violence. There's self-harm, violence from guards, etc. So Daniel reminds us in the episode that we cannot rest on our laurels where patterns of violence aren't being broken. He calls on the next generation of lawyers to pick up that mantle and work with these courageous clients and try and make these breakthroughs happen. He says, I know there are so many people now in the legal profession that have that ability and passion to bring change about. So that does leave me with great hope that we will break some of these cycles. Another guest, Mark Willers, KC, who I got to meet in person. And I mean, you could just, speaking to him in the studio here where he joined me, he just lives and breathes his work. His passion for climate justice and securing justice for marginalised communities like travellers and Roma gypsies it's just evident when you talk to him. He notes the importance of the courts in terms of making change, but he says that we really need to get politicians to change their behaviour, and he explores that question a little deeper in our episode. Some cases on climate justice, for example, one of his cases, Klimaseniorennen, the recent action which was taken by an association of senior women in Switzerland to the European Court of Human Rights, managed to convince the courts that the government needed to change. But ultimately, as Mark says, I think activists are likely to convince the electorate to send a message to the politicians who are responsible for adopting policy and legislation which will do the job of tackling climate change. And it's important that they are given the space to make this case, and that the case is effectively communicated and gets through to the electorate. Because if we can't vote out those that are failing to tackle climate change and failing to protect the rights of children and future generations, then we will get to our goal of achieving net zero, but going perhaps further than that and significantly mitigating or reducing the harm that is being caused by global warming. And so activism outside of the courts is going to be crucial. Now, Mark notes how activism works very well with litigation, and so many of his cases demonstrate that. And he says, he mentions, and this is true, even if a case is lost, so much work goes into highlighting the issue and galvanising communities to bring cases. We bring together young people, older generations are all brought together in these cases. And we do see even how very young people are able to bring challenges against their governments for a breach of their rights on climate policies. And in terms of climate justice, Mark says that the very fact of the litigation being brought is educating judges and is used as a kind of campaign tool in itself by our brave clients. He also commends the important work of NGOs who play a huge part in activism outside the courtroom. For example, in terms of Travellers and Gypsies, Mark and colleagues and people he works with, working together with NGOs, were able to convince politicians to adopt policies that would be adopted for the good in improving the way of life for many communities. It always helps if there is a coordinated push, indeed. And that advice in that episode is really worth listening to. Now, a very recent episode featured barrister Oscar Davies. Again, very candid and very insightful and interesting episode, charting Oscar's journey into law as the first barrister in the UK to be recognised as non-binary. And we discussed activism and the law from their perspective. Oscar noted how the term activist lawyer had been thrown around in a derogatory sense, and we all recall the government's scapegoating and marginalisation of so-called lefty lawyers or activist lawyers. I think we mention it quite regularly on our podcast, which is indeed where the title of our podcast came about. And while Oscar doesn't refer to himself as an activist as such, Oscar does say that in a broader sense, activism is important in shaping the law, but focuses on their work as a lawyer and the skills and tools that they can use to make change for the specific communities they work for. Oscar says change doesn't happen by being quiet or accepting the status quo, but putting yourself out there and above the threshold isn't for everyone. They're happy to take on this work despite receiving some negative commentary, particularly online, when it comes to representing the trans and non-binary community. It's shameful that we're still at this point, but Oscar's episode, I think, is really representative of how a lawyer is able to work for change while really knowing and understanding the challenges faced by a particular community that they are acting for, whether it's discrimination or other rights that are being breached. So Oscar also talks not only about how we should be changing the law and reviewing the law in the way that it might be discriminatory, but also how these changes would impact and benefit society as a whole. So it's an important episode that also looks at the language of not just the law, but how language is important in addressing these issues. Oscar also talks about pro bono work, which is something I think most of our guests have been involved in. And it is, that's a clear form of activism. They don't get paid, but many of those cases really make way for huge legal developments and for real and meaningful change. So that's just a brief selection of the responses from our guests. We've plenty more where that came from, as they say, going backwards and forwards as we will welcome new guests to the podcast in the new year. So please stay tuned for that. Now, I just thought I'd do a little summary of maybe looking at how activism and the law firstly work together. And I've just selected 5 points. They're quite obvious, but I thought it would be important just to kind of hone in this conversation a little bit deeper. And it will give me a little bit of context as well for when we ask this question with our future guests. So firstly, looking at legal reform through activism. Again, very obvious, but activism often acts as a catalyst for legal change. We just need to look at historical movements, notable historical movements like the civil rights movement in the US, the suffragette movement, going way back in time, which led to major legal reforms like the Civil Rights Act and the right to vote for women. So activists drawing attention to issues that require legal redress and forcing lawmakers to respond. Strategic litigation, again, something we've covered extensively on the podcast, activists using the law as a tool to advance their causes. So strategic litigation is really important and involves bringing cases to court with the intent of challenging laws or setting legal precedents. Climate change, we've discussed this already today, but that's a really great example of how activists have been used or can, use their activism to take legal action and hold governments accountable for environmental policies. Thirdly, looking at civil disobedience as a legal challenge. So activists engaging in civil disobedience, breaking the law, breaking laws that they see are unjust, to provoke legal challenges. So this tactic seeks to demonstrate the moral or ethical shortcomings of current laws. And again, we could look at historical examples. One that stands out is South Africa and apartheid. And these actions can obviously prompt legal debates at a minimum, but can also change and create significant reforms. Fourthly, the law as a shield for activists. So activists relying on legal protections like freedom of speech, assembly and the press to organise protests and challenge authority. And laws are enshrined in constitutions and even in, international human rights frameworks that will provide activists with such protections and legal grounds to operate even in politically repressive environments, which is often, as we know, very, very risky. And many activists take their life into their hands when doing so. And I'm just thinking of the gender apartheid episode that we had on looking at Iran and Afghanistan as well. And lastly, public interest law, which I suppose kind of ties into the strategic litigation point in a way that from the perspective of some of our guests that we've had on, public interest lawyers often work alongside activists to provide legal expertise and representation. And we've given so many examples of that, where lawyers will fight in the courtroom for causes that activists are champion on the streets, and one couldn't do it without the other. So it's a mutual beneficial relationship there. And I'm thinking of Frank McGuinness's episode as well, when we look at the tensions that arise as well between activism and the law, which is what he delved into a little bit in that episode. The law, number one, as a tool of oppression. So while activism aims to challenge injustice, the law can also serve as a tool of repression. Legal systems have historically upheld systems of inequality, such as slavery and segregation or colonial rule, forcing activists to work against the law. So governments sometimes use legal measures to silence activists with laws that restrict freedom of assembly, speech or political dissent, just by way of explanation of that. Now, the other one that I suppose is incredibly frustrating is the slow pace of legal change, whereby the legal system, as we all know, is often slow moving. And while activism, I'm just thinking of most activist movements, they need change urgently. And they're quite dynamic, but what they're asking for is on demand, and the time it takes to pass legislation or even to get to the end of a court case is really frustrating. And maybe that's where activists turn away maybe from the law as a tool for change and, use other methods as well. So there's certainly a tension because of the slow nature of legal reform. Okay, so that's just, a brief exploration of the relationship between the two for anybody who likes to explore that question in depth. Maybe it's just me. But I was thinking of examples as well. Recent examples that we covered on the podcast. We spoke about Black Lives Matter, the movement before, and police reform. And how that movement, which had been going on for a long time, even before the horrific incident of George Floyd, in that case, it played a crucial role in bringing issues of police brutality and systemic racism to the forefront of public consciousness. And there's no doubt that it did. And it led to calls for reforms like defunding the police, introducing body cameras, or revising legal immunity protections for law enforcement. However, as we know, these changes are piecemeal. It depends on what state they're being reviewed in America, and activists are continuing with that movement to argue that more radical reforms are needed. And of course, Leslie Thomas, Casey, who was on our podcast when we mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement to him, he obviously agreed that the movement brought awareness and attention, but the issues that it was focused on had been happening and have been happening in the UK for many, many years, decades. And lots of these cases were covered up or went unaddressed. So it's just an example, again, I suppose, of the frustration of how urgent reform was needed and asked for, and the system is working on a piecemeal basis or extremely slow in terms of addressing the radical reforms that are needed. And then looking at the international courts, where many people have lost hope. When we look at the global activism around what is happening in Gaza and across the occupied territories, Lebanon and Syria at the moment as well. We've discussed this many times on the podcast and will continue to do so. But despite the public and global outrage, neither politicians or the legal system is moving fast enough to stop the ongoing war crimes and to act on the evidence. And there's significant evidence put forward under the Genocide Convention, or indeed the arrest warrant applications before the ICC. Now, I appreciate that this example exposes the relationship between the international community and the international legal system, which has been deemed to be unfit for purpose by many, but nonetheless, it's what we have to work with. So, the whole saga is deeply infuriating and incredibly drawn out. And activists, I think, are mounting every day around the world in terms of expressing their frustration that nothing is being done. And lastly, I think an obvious one is climate change and activism as an example, where environmentalists have used international forums to demand urgent legal and policy action on climate change. Legal initiatives that we explored in the Mark Willers episode, and we will be exploring this in the next couple of months, so stay tuned. Lawsuits against governments and corporations for failing to meet climate targets really show, and I think it's a really excellent example of showing how activism and the law are intertwined in this kind of global struggle that affects all of us. So yeah, I think it's fair to say activism and the law can be mutually reinforcing when activists use legal challenges to achieve reform, or when the law responds to social demands. And when we look at how lawyers relate to both activism and the law to get results for their clients or the organisations that they work for. However, as explored, we do recognise the tensions that exist between the two. And I guess that's why it is a kind of, although an interdependent relationship exists, it can be quite complex. And I think it's been really useful and interesting to review our guests' thoughts on that question, and also to have a little roundup of what the two mechanisms serve to address and how they can work together. So both activism and the law are crucial in the pursuit of justice and social progress. I think that can be agreed on. So I hope you enjoyed today's mini episode. And just remember, if you like our podcast, please review it 5 stars and share as much as possible. And thank you for listening. We cannot do this without your support. I would ask you to look at our website and to join our book club, which is part of the Activist Lawyer. You'll see it on our website, where we advertise our book club every 6 to 7 weeks, and we'll put forward a book that relates to law and activism and activism lawyers. So have a look at that, and I'd like to thank you for listening today.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.